This is a speech by Theodore Roosevelt on April 10th, 1899. I'll talk about it, and then there's a few ideas I wanted to try to think about afterwards. I wish to preach not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of the strenuous life, the life of toil and effort, of labor and strife, to preach that highest form of success which comes, not to the man who desires mere easy peace, but to the man who does not shrink from danger, from hardship, or from bitter toil, and who, out of these, wins the splendid ultimate triumph. A life of slothful ease, a life of that peace which springs merely from lack either of desire or of power to strive after great things, is as little worthy of a nation as of an individual. I ask only that which every self-respecting American demands from himself and from his sons shall be demanded of the American nation as a whole. Who among you would teach your boys that ease, that peace, is to be the first consideration in their eyes, to be the ultimate goal after which they strive? You work yourselves, and you bring up your sons to work. If you are rich and are worth your salt, you will teach your sons that, though they may have leisure, it is not to be spent in idleness. For wisely used, leisure merely means that those who possess it, being free from the necessity of working for their livelihood, are all the more bound to carry on some kind of non-remunerative work in science, in letters, in art, in exploration, in historical research, work of the type we most need in this country, the successful carrying out of which reflects most honor upon the nation. We do not admire the man of timid peace. We admire the man who embodies victorious effort, the man who never wrongs his neighbor, who is prompt to help a friend, but who has those virile qualities necessary to win in the stern strife of actual life. It is hard to fail, but it is worse never to have tried to succeed. In the last analysis, a healthy state can exist only when the men and women who make it up lead clean, vigorous, healthy lives. When the children are so trained that they shall endeavor not to shirk difficulties, but to overcome them. Not to seek ease, but to know how to wrest triumph from toil and risk. The man must be glad to do a man's work, to dare and endure and to labor, to keep himself and to keep those dependent upon him. The woman must be the housewife, the helpmeet of the homemaker, the wise and fearless mother of many healthy children. In one of Dowdett's powerful and melancholy books, he speaks of the fear of maternity, the haunting terror of the young wife of the present day. When such words can be truthfully written of a nation, that nation is rotten to the heart's core. When men fear work or fear righteous war, when women fear motherhood, they tremble on the brink of doom. And well it is that they should vanish from the earth, where they are fit subjects for the scorn of all men and women who are themselves strong and brave and high-minded. As it is with the individual, so it is with the nation. It is a base untruth to say that happy is the nation that has no history. Thrice happy is the nation that has a glorious history. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the grey twilight that knows not victory nor defeat. If, in 1861, the men who loved the Union had believed that peace was the end of all things and war and strife the worst of all things, and had acted up to their belief, we would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. We would have saved hundreds of millions of dollars. Moreover, besides saving all the blood and treasure we then lavished, we would have prevented the heartbreak of many women, the disillusion of many homes, and we would have spared the country those months of gloom and shame when it seemed as if our armies marched only to defeat. We could have avoided all this suffering simply by shrinking from strife. And if we had thus avoided it, we would have shown that we were weaklings, and that we were unfit to stand among the great nations of the earth. Thank God for the iron in the blood of our fathers, the men who upheld the wisdom of Lincoln and bore sword or rifle in the armies of Grant. Let us, the children of the men who proved themselves equal to the mighty days, let us, the children of the man who carried the great Civil War to a triumphant conclusion, praise the God of our fathers that the ignoble counsels of peace were rejected, that the suffering and loss, the blackness of sorrow and despair were unflinchingly faced, and the years of strife endured. For in this end, the slave was freed, the Union restored, and the mighty American Republic placed once more as a helmeted queen among nations. We of this generation do not have to face a task such as that our fathers faced, but we have our tasks, and woe to us if we fail to perform them. The timid man, the lazy man who distrusts his country, the over-civilized man who has lost the great fighting, masterful virtues, the ignorant man, and the man of dull mind, whose soul is incapable of feeling the mighty lift that thrills stern men with empires in their brains. All these, of course, shrink from seeing the nation undertake its new duties, shrink from seeing us build a navy and an army adequate to our needs, shrink from seeing us do our share of the world's work by bringing order out of chaos in the great fair tropic islands from which the valor of our soldiers and the sailors has driven the Spanish flag. These are the men who fear the strenuous life, who fear the only national life which is really worth leading. They believe in that cloistered life which saps the hardy virtues in a nation as it saps them in the individual. Or else they are wedded to that base spirit of gain and greed which recognizes in commercialism the be-all and end-all of national life, instead of realizing that, though an indispensable element, it is, after all, but one of the many elements that go to make up true national greatness. No country can long endure if its foundations are not laid deep in the maternal and material prosperity which comes from thrift, from business energy and enterprise, from hard, unsparing effort in the fields of industrial activity. But neither was any nation ever yet truly great if it relied upon material prosperity alone. All honor must be paid to the architects of our material prosperity, to the great captains of industry who have built our factories and our railroads, to the strong men who toil for wealth with brain or hand. For great is the debt of the nation to these and their kind. But our debt is yet greater to the men whose highest type is to be found in a statesman like Lincoln, a soldier like Grant. They showed by their lives that they recognized the law of work, the law of strife. They toiled to win a competence for themselves and those dependent upon them, but I recognize that there were yet other and even loftier duties, duties to the nation and duties to the race. We cannot sit huddled within our own borders and avow ourselves merely an assemblage of well-to-do hucksters who care nothing for what happens beyond. Such a policy would defeat even its own end. For as nations grow to have ever wider and wider interests, and are brought into closer and closer contact, if we are to hold our own in the struggle for naval and commercial supremacy, we must build up our power without our own borders. We must build the Isthmian Canal, and we must grasp the points of vantage which will enable us to have our say in deciding the destiny of the oceans of the East and the West. The army and the navy, the sword and shield, which this nation must carry if she is to do her duty among the nations of the earth, if she is not to stand merely as the China of the Western Hemisphere. Our proper conduct towards the tropic islands we wrested from Spain is merely the form which our duty has taken at the moment. Of course, we are bound to handle the affairs of our own household well. We must see that there is civic honesty, civic cleanliness, civic good sense in our home administration of city, state, and nation. We must strive for honesty in office, for honesty toward the creditors of the nation and of the individual, for the widest freedom of individual initiative where possible, and for the wisest control of individual initiative where it is hostile to the welfare of the many. But because we set our own household in order, we are not thereby excused from playing our part in the great affairs of the world. A man's first duty is to take his own home, but he is not thereby excused from doing his duty to the state. For if he fails in this second duty, it is under the penalty of ceasing to be a free man. In the same way, while the nation's first duty is within its own borders, it is not thereby absolved from facing its duties to the world as a whole. And if it refuses to do so, it merely forfeits its right to struggle for a place among the peoples that shape the destiny of mankind. England's rule in India and Egypt has been of great benefit to England, for it has trained up generations of men accustomed to look at the larger and loftier side of public life. It has been of even greater benefit to India and Egypt. And finally, and most of all, it has advanced the cause of civilization. So, if we do our duty aright in the Philippines, we will add to that national renown which is the highest and finest part of national life, will greatly benefit the people of the Philippine Islands, and, above all, we will play our part well in the great work of uplifting mankind. But to do this work, keep ever in mind that we must show in a very high degree the qualities of courage, of honesty, and of good judgment. Resistance must be stamped out. The first and all-important work to be done is to establish the supremacy of our flag. We must put down armed resistance before we can accomplish anything else, and there should be no parleying, no faltering in dealing with our foe. As for those in our own country who encourage the foe, we can afford contemptuously to disregard them, but it must be remembered that their utterances are not saved from being treasonable merely by the fact that they are despicable. When once we have put down armed resistance, when once our rule is acknowledged, then an even more difficult task will begin, for then we must see to it that the islands are administered with absolute honesty and with good judgment. If we let the public service of the islands be turned into the prey of the spoils politician, we shall have begun to tread the path which Spain trod to her own destruction. We must send out there only good and able men, chosen for their fitness, and not because of their partisan service. And these men must not only administer impartial justice to the natives, and serve their own government with honesty and fidelity, but must show the utmost tact and firmness, remembering that, with such people as those with whom we are to deal, weakness is the greatest of crimes, and that next to weakness comes lack of consideration for their principles and prejudices. I preach to you then, my countrymen, that our country calls not for the life of ease, but for the life of strenuous endeavour. The 20th century looms before us big with the fate of many nations. If we stand idly by, if we seek merely swollen, slothful ease and ignoble peace, if we shrink from the hard contests where men must win at hazard of their lives and at the risk of all they hold dear, then the bolder and stronger peoples will pass us by, and will win for themselves the domination of the world. Let us therefore boldly face the life of strife, resolute to do our duty well and manfully, resolute to uphold righteousness by deed and by word, resolute to be both honest and brave, to serve high ideals, yet to use practical methods. Above all, let us shrink from no strife, moral or physical, within or without the nation, provided we are certain the strife is justified. For it is only through strife, through hard and dangerous endeavour, that we shall ultimately win the goal of true national greatness. Okay, so there's a few ideas in there. Some of them good, a little bad, and quite a lot are out of favor, or in other times, shall we say. The Americanocentrism is very strong with Roosevelt here. So this bit I'm going to go by paragraph here, where he says, in the last analysis, a healthy state can exist only when the men and women who make it up lead clean, vigorous, healthy lives. When the children are so trained that they shall endeavour not to shirk difficulties but to overcome them, not to seek ease but to know how to wrest triumph from toil and risk. Risk is the operative word here in that entire sentence. Risk is the operative word in the modern day, I'd say. Because I think that what he's talking about here is sort of that American idea that, hey, if you work hard, you get a reward. If you dare to believe, then good things happen. If you keep trying and trying and trying, even if you fail at first and fail again and fail a second and a third and fifth and fourth time, one day, if you keep going on, you'll make it. You'll become rich or famous or happy, as the case may be. And that's the toil part, how to wrest triumph from toil and risk. But the other side is risk, right? You don't know it's going to work. You might try and try and try and fail forever. Right? There's no definitive rule that it has to work out. And I think, like, when I was growing up, the idea is you go to high school, then you go to college, and you get a good job, and then you buy a house, start a family, get a nice car, go on a few vacations, retire at the end, and, you know, your life is sort of not set up for you, but you know where it's going to lead. You know what's going to happen. It's like, if I work hard, then I know how I'm going to end up. I'm going to end up like my grandparents, right? I'm going to end up owning my own house. I'm going to end up with my own life. And when that doesn't work, then you realize that the risk part has taken control, right? That it doesn't always work out. And so the risk here is a matter of odds, right? when we extend that risk across an entire nation, across 100 million people growing up in one way or another at this time, you end up with a what would you say, a generation that feels that the risk part is too large a piece of the equation, which feels that working hard doesn't get you where you thought it was going to. And so it becomes much harder to keep going. It becomes much harder to teach that one should keep working hard. Teach your kids that they should keep working hard and aiming for a better life, because the idea starts to take over that it's gambling, right? It's who I was born to, or it's if I get lucky, and less of if I work hard, because you're working hard, but if you still at 30 years old, can't afford a house, and you're never found anyone to be in love with, and you've got some credit card debt, and you haven't taken a vacation in 2 years, or you work 3 jobs, and maybe you do something on the weekend, but you just see this grinding you out for another 30 years, and you'd be like, well, I even be able to own a house, will you even be able to retire at the end of this? What is my life going to look like? And it doesn't seem worth it. Right, so as he says here, as it is with the individual, so it is with the nation. And this is based on truth to say that happy is a nation that has no history. Thrice happy is a nation that has a glorious history. So even if my life isn't going so great, if I have a history, if I can go back to my ancestors, my books, to the existence I am a part of, then I can rely upon that in hard times and in harsh times. I'm like, hey, life isn't so good for me, but life will be better for who comes after me. Or it's not good right now, but in 10 years, I'll have made it, right? Small steps to get to a better life. But if you don't think that, if you grow up today, especially, hearing about the national debt rising up, and we're not taking control of it at all. We're just spending like crazy, and one day it's going to bite us. And Social Security is running out of money, and one day that's going to bite us. And we're running out of oil, and one day that's going to bite us. And the temperature is rising, and one day that's going to bite us. And the population is aging, and other states are growing faster than us. And we're running out of water, and we're poisoning the land with pesticides and all this, right? And even if you don't see terrible things happening today, the only story you hear is bad things will happen, bad things will happen, bad things are going to happen. Slowly, slowly, slowly. And partially the outlook right now is not great because, of just the age, right? We're not at, or people of my generation aren't quite at the, we're 50s, 60s, getting ready to retire, ready to rest. And we aren't at the young point where we're in, 18, 16, 24, and thinking, hey, life is going to get better eventually. We're in that point where we're thinking, look, the last 10 years weren't great for me, and if the next 10 years also aren't great, then I'm going to be in a spot of trouble. And we're thinking back, and we're going, it doesn't seem great. It seems like we're hearing the same stories and the same problems over and over and over again. Like the issues of the 90s are the same as the issues of the 2000s and the 2010s and now the 2020s, right? It's racism, it's financial inequality, it's the Middle East again. All the same problems just keep happening. And the glorious history of America, in my case, doesn't seem so glorious when I've lived through it. I mean, Roosevelt here talks about, his forefathers, right? For in the end, the slave was freed, the Union restored, and the mighty American Republic placed once more as a helmeted queen among nations. What did I grow up with? No great stories. Like, we weren't saving the world. We were in the Middle East screwing things up. We weren't leading the world towards democracy. We were hearing about, Vietnam and how we had been on the wrong side the entire time. We were seeing protesters, like we had been taught in school about, protesters in the South during the civil rights movements and how they were being attacked and seen as the bad guys, essentially. And then now, years later, we're like, well, they must have been the good guys. And then we turn on the news and we see, like, what was it? It was Occupy Wall Street, I think, was the first one I remember. Oh, there were protesters and, no, these protesters are bad, right? And then we hear about, Indian reservations standing in place of oil pipelines and standing in the way of oil pipelines. And we hear, oh, those protesters are bad. And then, last year it was college students protesting against Israel, and, well, those protesters are bad. And, in the back of my mind, well, my history that I've heard, that I was taught growing up, that I remember, is protesters were kind of good, because protesters were free speech. But now you're saying they're bad. So what's going on here, right? Are we just repeating the mistakes of the past? Are these protesters different in some way? Are the times different? Or are we making mistakes again? Like where's the positive and negatives here? I can look into it, right? I can read the histories. I can watch the news. I can listen to both sides. I can sort of figure it out. But if I have my own life, if I'm doing my own things with my own problems, I don't have that much time. And we think back to, what were the majority of people doing during the Civil War, or the War for Independence, or the Spanish-American War, which Roosevelt references here. And the answer is most people were just living their lives. Most people were just doing what they normally do. Going to school, going to work, getting families, growing up. And that's the silent majority of history, right? And if we think of that, then, that glory of American history seems to have faded quite a bit in today. We're still the mightiest nation on earth, but why exactly? Right? Like, I've traveled to other countries, and I've seen, like, their healthcare systems, which were more effective than, the healthcare systems seem to be here. I've seen public transportation be better in other places. I've seen people lead happier lives because they were more relaxed. And they didn't have to live 2 hours outside of the city because that's the only place they could afford a home. They walk to work or something like that. I've met people who, speak multiple languages because they learn that in the school, and they can travel to these different parts of the world. And yet here I want to have one Spanish class, and I sort of picked something up, but I didn't really need it. And, I can go on and on about different events, but America doesn't always seem the most moral or the greatest place on the world anymore. Even though we have this glorious history, not sure how it's been kept up is the feeling of today, I think. I mean, Roosevelt here also talks about, national greatness and how, let me see. All honor must be paid to the architects of our material prosperity, to the great captains of industry who have built our factories and our railroads, to the strong men who toil for wealth with brain or hand, for great is the debt of the nation to these and their kind. I mean, so America, at least when I was growing up, was sort of escaping the specter of the capitalist communist battle. and capitalism seems to have won. And specifically like this private ownership capitalism, where individuals own items and decide what happens with those items, and there are certain limits on what the government can do and order people to do, and so on. And there are definite ways in which, if I look at specifically like the American versus the European versions of social capitalism, where America has done better, right? America is richer. Their stock market goes up faster and has gone up faster for 20 years. The average American is richer, I think, although that may be changing. Richer in terms of pure money, but that might be debatable because of the wealth disparity, which has increased, because that's also happened. And I mean, when we look at the infrastructure of America, he talks about the material prosperity, the great captains of industry who built our factories and our railroads. And yet today that seems to have been done before my time, if that makes sense. Right? The days of the great railroads are over here in the States. We're stuck with cars. And we have, there's a city, there's a road in my city, I-5, I think, which has been under construction for 3.5 years. There were roads up near my grandmother's house which had potholes in them, and those potholes showed up every month like clockwork. They would fill them in, then the pothole would reappear. Fill them in, pothole would reappear. It never quite got finished or fixed. There was always something yet to do. And when I look around my town, I see like what great buildings being made, what great efforts being undertaken, what great factories being built. What's the story of America today? And it's less clear than I think it was. So Roosevelt talks here, the timid man, the lazy man, the man who distrusts his country, the over-civilized man who's lost great fighting, masterful virtues, and he also talks about the person who loves peace. Roosevelt he was part of the Rough Riders, right? He was very much, let's go fight, and that's how we show that we're manly men. But, there are different ways of fighting. There are different types of peace. It doesn't always have to be, the army and the navy or the sword and shield which this nation must carry if she was to do her duty among the nations of the earth. It's also the ideas, the spirit of the nation and the country and the people. I mean, as I've traveled around, I've met folk who still believed that America was the land of the free. I mean, believed it in their hearts, that if they could just remove themselves from where they were at, if they could just leave their country and go to America, then they could make it. They could work hard and they could have a good life for them and their family, and it would all be great because there was opportunity in the land of the West. And then I talk to a lot of Americans today who grow up here and they don't feel that. They feel they're going to work at McDonald's or something for the rest of their lives. And, maybe that's because of the area I live in. Maybe because it's of the people I talk with. But it seems as if there's more of them than there were when I was a kid. Like when I was in high school, everyone thought, we'll make it. And then I talk to those same people today, and they don't think that as much. They think they're happy or content with what they're doing, which is a good job, a good house, a good family. And they want to keep that because they're afraid of losing it because they don't have a fallback idea. They're like, well, if I have to start all over again, I'm not going to make it. If I lose this chance, if I lose this job, then I don't know what I'm going to do. And there are still people out there who have the ability to take time away from work and think about themselves, devote themselves to hobbies, do something great with their lives. But it just seems there's fewer and fewer as I grow older. Okay, and then there's how should I say this? While a nation's first duty is within its own borders, it is not thereby absolved from facing its duties in the world as a whole. And if it refuses to do so, it merely forfeits its right to struggle for a place among the peoples that shape the destiny of mankind. So Roosevelt is not an isolationist. He would very much like the U.S. to be out there in the world doing things, because the world is going to move on, the world is going to change, and if we are not involved in that, then the world is going to change without us, and it will be to our detriment, because someone else will have their hands on the reins, someone else will be directing the boat, and we won't be necessarily left behind, but we will not be favored. So he's very much, we need to get up there because partially the world is shrinking. He talks about this earlier. The world is getting smaller and closer. We can't step away as much. We can't shirk the duties of America. We can't step away from the wars and the battles of the both physical and mental and spiritual and all that, right? It's not just Cold War, we need to fight for democracy, but we need to fight for some some je ne sais quoi, some feeling of greatness, of possibility, of hope. And we also need to have that for ourselves, instead of the idea that we're just barely making it. So Roosevelt also has some, let's say, ideas of the times, right? He talks about, the man has to be hard and do hard work. The woman must be the housewife, the helpmeet of the homemaker, the wise and fearless mother of many healthy children. And one of Dowdett's powerful and melancholy books, he speaks of the fear of maternity, the haunting terror of the young wife of the present day. When such words can be truthfully written of a nation, that nation is rotten to the heart's core. Okay, so obviously that's extremely sexist, but we can also take a more modern view at it and say, well, there's man's work and woman's work, and it's not necessarily connected to sex or gender anymore. It's sort of the way we call certain aspects of work we have to do, we undertake. There are, literally, like, work inside the house, work outside the house. If you're focused on creating something, raising up, and work focused on work and money and safety, right? And today, these are not quite so set in their ways according to whether someone is a man or a woman. It's more the duties one might undertake. And there are 100 different ways to split that up and so on. But the idea is here, right? The idea that he's talking about in his old-timey way is that you can't shirk from labor. Work can't be just a burden. Work needs to be an opportunity. And you can't shirk from thinking, I don't want to have kids because my kids are just going to grow up in this horrible world and we can't support them. And I don't want to stay home, for 3 years raising this kid, losing my career. We can't even afford our house. Would you have to move in with my parents? Oh my gosh. These are complicated situations would happen to people as individuals. But if we think of them on a national level, it might be just asking, what's the purpose of work? And what do we think is going to happen for our next generation, for the kids after us? And so if the purpose of work is, pure capitalism, pure let's make money, well, money by itself isn't a very good goal, because if you can't spend the money, if you don't spend the money and then you're just hoarding it and you have all this paper and that's great, sort of, it's like you have good, like if you have a bunch of gold bars, you can't do anything with them. You have to do something with the gold bars for them to be valuable. They have to be tradable. It must be something you want for the money you have, or else there's no point in having money. And so we have, in the modern world, I'd say something like, consumerism. I can buy books. I can always buy more books. I mean, give me $1 billion. I'm going to go out to the nearest Barnes and Noble and just start throwing stuff in like 14 shopping carts. I'm going to go buy a brand new computer with a 5090 in it or something. I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to build the tower to my magnificence and so on. And so that's one thing you can do. If you can't afford a house, but you can afford all these tiny little things, then maybe you're working towards that. Maybe you're working for your Pokemon collection, or you're working for a collection of the really good paints, like I might like. Or you're working for a vacation you can buy and purchase and involve yourself in. And, there's two sides to this idea of money. If you don't have enough money and you don't have anything you want, you're in trouble either way, right? You want to have a balance between those. And as for the next generation, it's not just, do I have kids? That's can be a very individualistic thing to deal with and think about. But more, do I even care what happens 100 years from now? Right? Like I personally might say, well, it's not very smart to keep relying on oil, because one day the oil's going to run out. I mean, just plain fact. And maybe it's not today, maybe it's in 50 years or 100 years or 3,000 years, who knows? But it runs out eventually. And so why are we not running away from oil as fast as we can and going to electric? Because it could just work. And then we can recycle the batteries, and then we don't have to import oil from other nations or dig it out of the ground. We just take the batteries we already have after they died, recycle them, and repeat ad infinitum. Like, if I'm thinking, what is life going to be like 4,000 years from now? I'm not thinking burning oil. So, that's something I might think about. At the same time, you're going, well, what about me in 5 years, right? If I don't have a car and I can't go cross country, is that going to put a crimp in my plans? If I support electrification, what does that do to the gas prices that I rely upon to get to work, right now or in 2 weeks from now? What happens to all the people who are working in that industry? So I'm thinking 4,000 years in the future, but I'm also thinking 2 weeks in the future or 5 years in the future, and I'm coming to different conclusions. So which time period do you look at? Which time period are you concerned with? And this is just, one little tiny thing. If we go into rights, if we go into, social rights, if we go into economic circumstances, if we go into the availability of housing, and we look at it 10 years or 20 years or 30 or 50 years from now, it looks very different at those points in time. And sometimes it's very obvious, like electricity is the far future. Electricity or hydrogen or, nuclear fusion, for all we know. And the near future, well, oil's a big part of our economy, and it's going to hurt people and companies if we don't make that money, if we don't have that oil going through. But you can also ask, well, what about the health effects of burning oil, right? What does that do to us? And it gets all sorts of complicated from there on in. The costs of raising the quality of gas like California does so that it produces less pollutants. The cost of changing where we get our oil from. Is it heavy or light? How do we break it up? Do we have the refineries? Who builds them? Who pays for them? Is this a public endeavor or a private endeavor or some mix of the two? How do we ensure this? Who's in charge of this? Who gets the benefits from what we're doing right now? And so Roosevelt talks about greatness here. I think that's sort of interesting because it's not something we think about nowadays, I would say. I think we think in more practical terms. So, for example, something that might come up is, again, sort of very much an anachronistic view. He says, England's rule in India and Egypt has been a great benefit to England. It has been of even greater benefit to India and Egypt. This, of course, is incredibly questionable. In the one hand, you could say that the influence of Western technology specifically has been of benefit. On the other hand, you could say the influence of colonial powers upon the peoples and the governments of these nations has been of horrific effect. And obviously, Roosevelt here is incredibly biased. But specifically, what I'd like to look at here is he talks about the Philippines. So this is after the Spanish-American War, I believe, where the United States takes over the Philippines. And the idea is that the Filipinos are sort of backwards, and the United States has to rule over them and teach them how to be democratic and how to live correct, civilized lives. And then one day we'll leave and they'll take care of themselves. We ended up staying for, I want to say, like 70 years or so, because they were never quite ready, as far as the United States was concerned. What a surprise. Eventually, there was an outcry in the Philippines, and they elected their own government, and the United States got pushed out. But of course, what happened then is, if I remember correctly, they immediately got taken over or elected a dictator in Ferdinand Marcos, I think it was. And we can sort of see interesting parallels during, Roosevelt's viewpoint here, where he's talking about we need to take care of the Philippines and teach them how to live, civilized, democratic lives. And what happened in my lifetime, which is Afghanistan and Iraq, right? That was the idea, when I went to high school. That's the idea we're told when I'm in middle school and elementary school, when all this took place. That we're going into Afghanistan to A, punish the terrorists, and B, make them democratic. The people and the populace are under some sort of horrible threat. They've been pushed down by dictators. There's mass death and killing and people in prison, and we have to go save them. I mean, that was the story that we were told as kids. And, the longer the battle went on, the longer the fighting went on, the worse that story became. And the more we started to go, it doesn't seem like they're very welcoming to us. It doesn't seem like democracy's really popping up here. It doesn't seem like the fighting's stopping. The fighting just keeps going on and on and on and on. And are we doing any good in the Middle East? It doesn't seem like it. Doesn't feel like it. Now, I wonder if it's the same idea, right? This idea Roosevelt pushes, which is that America should go out in the world and do good, great things, should be noticed, right? Shouldn't just be a commercial enterprise. The commercial enterprises are a part of it. That capitalism is a powerful source of progress, technological and ecological, of some sort of like that. Which is a whole nother debate. But there's also something more that we should be aiming for, something that money and wealth helps us to achieve. But, again, the idea is that if we have a bunch of money, that doesn't mean anything if we don't want to buy anything with that money. We want to do something with the wealth and abilities we have. Either build up our own state and our house and our people, or build up somebody else's state and house and people. right? We don't want to fritter it away on nothing. And it kind of seems like Afghanistan, we kind of did. Though there are modern complications to that, and who knows what it'll look like in 40 years. And I'm sure there's lots of people in the United States who were still very much of the belief that we did some good, that, that we improved something. There's probably also plenty of people who think we screwed it all up. I made everything worse. But at least Roosevelt, I think in this case, has something to it, where he can say, we tried. We tried. Maybe we screwed up. Maybe we were lied to by our own politicians, a la Vietnam. But there's also that idea of America, that one of the extremely interesting things about America in the Philippines, that I was taught at least, is that America won the Spanish-American War, took over the Philippines, and then took over the Philippines with the express understanding that they would give it back to the Filipinos, right? That it was a commercial colonial enterprise, but it was not designed to be a political colonial enterprise. They weren't entering into the administration of the Philippines with the express purpose of holding it forever under their dominion. The same thing in Panama, right? That we built the Panama Canal, and it's ours for 50 years, and then we give it back to the Panamanians. So at least there's this idea behind it. We go into the Middle East, and hey, we screwed up, but at least we didn't sit back and watch it explode in nuclear fire as Pakistan and India bombed each other into oblivion, and Israel and Iran bombed each other into oblivion. They're still standing today, so maybe we did good. That's the idea somewhere in there, and maybe it's wrong. Or maybe like Vietnam, we'll go back. I've been to Vietnam, and there are still places where American bombs are in the ground, and there are dangerous villages where you have to be careful where you walk because the ground might explode on you. There are museums, and there are people who've lost limbs, but it's also not a terrible place to be. Vietnam is quite a nice place to visit for an American. It doesn't feel like we're in danger or we're bad. It's just, hey, we fought a bunch in the past, but now we want to move on and enter the new world, whatever that may be. So at least there's this sense of strenuous endeavor. It fails a lot, and I think he marks something here which we've mostly forgot. Okay, weakness is the greatest of crimes, so he says, but also, and that next to weakness comes lack of consideration for their principles and prejudices. This is the idea, to me at least, that you can't force a country or a people to be something they don't want to be. You can't nation build in a place that does not call out for itself to be a nation. I think that the Philippines is still struggling with exactly how to elect politicians who, adequately reflect the will of the people and follow the rule of law. I think they haven't quite gotten that down yet, as evidenced by, Marcos, and then they elected somebody normal, I think, and then they elected, the guy who killed a bunch of drug dealers extrajudicially, and then now they've got, Marcos's son or grandson or something. Which would make one of my old teachers who was Filipino, and she used to talk about that, and she would spin in her grave over that fact. I don't think she's dead, actually. She's probably might have gone to her grave over that fact. So I'm a little prejudiced with the information I have. And then, of course, you have the United States, who never really got over the Civil War and the civil rights issues, and is still also repeating that battle between, Hamilton and Jefferson, or between the Confederation versus the strong central government we have today. It was still dealing with, McCarthyism and anti-communism as scare tactics, which is still dealing with freedom of the press and how we deal with that in the new technological world, with how we deal with presidents who are, at the very least, extremely divisive and confrontational, we'll say. So this is the hard part here. To achieve the goal of true national greatness, you have to be both honest and brave, to serve high ideals, yet to use practical methods. And if we go back to the beginning, practical methods involve risk. Practical methods involve not being sure that things will work out. Practical methods involve maybe losing your shirt on your job because you made a bad investment. And practical effects turn into high ideals when we continue anyway and keep going. It says, the first and all-important work to be done is to establish the supremacy of our flag. And the flag here is, I would say, an idea or a symbol. Not literally the flag, but like the idea that there's something still great in America. And that we need to figure out what to do. It's not just battles and war. It's this more long, drawn-out, commercial style, battle over years and decades to see what happens in the next 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 or 300 years. And which area, which span of time you want to think about when we act. When it is worth resting to regather our strength and focus on who we are, and when the strenuous life of toil and effort, of labor and strife, is what we need to be doing. Because one thing that I do think he gets wrong is that you can be strong all the time. We can't. There are moments in every person's life where you need to stop and slow down and rest, or something breaks. You have to reevaluate. Set yourself up, strong on your feet. Take a deep breath, calm down, and think through the issue. Without all this screaming and yelling and short-sighted viewpoints, which look at the next day and the next day and nothing but that. So to end with, right, that's the trial, that's the trouble. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to tank rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the grey twilight that knows not victory nor defeat. And it really feels that America today is living in that grey twilight that lives neither victory nor defeat. It doesn't seem like we're aiming to be great. It seems like we're aiming to hold on to greatness, but not being entirely sure what that is.